Our moderator is Ian Masters. He's going to introduce tonight's speakers. Ian's a BBC-trained broadcast journalist. He's spent 25 years covering national security affairs in public radio. He's the host of Background Briefing and Live from the Left Coast, which air on Sundays on KPFK. Ian's been a senior fellow at UCLA's Center for Strategic and International Affairs and the UCLA Center for International Relations. And he was a consultant at the Center for National Security Studies at Los Alamos Laboratories in New Mexico. So please join me in welcoming Ian Masters. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia, and welcome to you all. When we originally scheduled this forum months ago, we thought that it would be useful to discuss a subject that Angelenos deal with every day, which festers on the back burner as our politicians give lip service to gridlock while we sit in traffic for hours, burning expensive foreign oil, polluting the already dirty air, listening to Rush Limbaugh and contributing to global warming. What could be more dystopian than that? But recent events like the collapse of the global economy have moved tonight's discussion from the theoretical into the possible, if not the practical. President Obama is about to dump $1 trillion into the void to stimulate our stagnant economy back to life, to staunch the bleeding of jobs, homes, incomes, and savings before we reach that fiscal flat line and enter the abyss we are staring at. The good news is that we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for smart growth, to build an intercontinental electric freight and passenger rail system and a smart green national electric grid powered by a variety of clean sources like wind and solar for trains and hybrid, then purely electric cars and trucks. We also have an opportunity to address the erosion and collapse of state and local revenue bases, to ward off urban blight and decay, and to re-employ millions laid off by corporate America with a new urbanism, universal broadband for the home office, more mass transit, less commuting, and a rebirth of real family values with more time to nurture children who will not be hanging out at malls, long since vacant, having been turned into libraries, galleries, and playgrounds. The bad news is that Congress gets to allocate the money that they are now arguing over. And if the military-industrial congressional complex, as Eisenhower originally called it, and farm subsidies to agribusiness and bailouts to Wall Street are to be the models for this new government spending, then instead of a chicken in every pot, we'd be better off with a pot plant in every chicken coop. So, to avoid this nightmare and wake up to a new dream, we should all help our new president find the courage to employ his apparent wisdom with imagination and vision, not to throw pork at the problem with shovel-ready freeways to nowhere, but to reimagine and rebuild a new America. Tonight we will challenge our speakers to fill in the gaps between what can and should be done and what we are likely to end up with if this current crisis does not become an opportunity. We will begin with Stefanos Polyzoides, who will speak for about 50 minutes or so, followed by Professor Kenneth Sprawl. Then we'll have a brief discussion on stage before opening up for Q&A from you, our downsized, outsourced, maxed out, and anxious audience. Stefanos Polyzoides' career covers the areas of architectural and urban design, education, design and execution, and theory. His professional experiences span educational, institutional, and civic buildings, historic rehabilitation, commercial projects, housing, campus planning, and urban design, as well as new urbanism, transit-oriented development, mixed-use development, housing, and sustainability. From 1973 until 1997, he was Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Southern California and has been visiting professor at several prestigious schools of architecture. From 1983 through 1990, he was on the advisory board of the School of Architecture at Princeton University. He is the co-founder of the Congress for the New Urbanism, a national organization reforming suburban sprawl, and is a member of the board of directors. With his partner, Elizabeth Moule, he founded Moule and Polyzoides, Architects and Urbanists in 1982. Across the nation and around the world, Mr. Polyzoides has led projects in New Jersey, Florida, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Guatemala, Mexico, Anguilla, Dubai, and Saudi Arabia. His recent projects include the 56,000-acre Altarisco project for SunCal in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the new extensions of Riverwalk in San Antonio, Texas. Other current projects include master plans for downtown Santa Ana and downtown Whittier, California, and he has recently completed the East Downtown Albuquerque master plan, as well as 2 downtown-specific plans for mixed-use neighborhoods and districts in Southern California, downtown Ventura, and downtown Newhall. Following the ravages of Hurricane Katrina in Mississippi, Mr. Polyzoides was asked by Governor Harley Barber to participate in a national charrette to provide emergency urban design and planning services to the communities that were devastated and to lead in the reconstruction efforts of Biloxi. Stefanos Polyzoides is the author of 2 books, Los Angeles Courtyard Housing, A Typological Analysis, and R.M. Schindler, Architect. His research has produced 4 distinguished exhibitions and exhibition catalogs, Caltech 1910 to 1950, Myron Hunt 1868 to 1952, Wallace Neff, and Johnson, Kaufman, and Coate. He is a Seaside Award recipient, the nation's most prestigious award in the field of urbanism. Ladies and gentlemen, Stefanos Polyzoides.
Thank you very much, Ian, for your kind introduction, and thank you all for being here tonight. I'm sure you've all held the aphorism that those who do not heed the lessons of history are bound to repeat it. As an architect and an urbanist, I would like to add that those who don't understand history are clueless, and they have no hope to intervene and lead the future growth of the universe that they inhabit. Much of what is around us from a physical perspective, much of what's around us from an institutional structure point of view, has its roots in actions that go back dozens, if not hundreds of years, and the history of a region is fundamental to the realities and the challenges we face here on a daily basis. So I have decided to not only give you an idea eventually of what it is that I think we should be doing in Los Angeles to face the next quarter century, but also to give you a sense about what the history of this region is, how it came to be formed, and the periods through which this urban development was sustained and developed. So if I can have the slides, please. Los Angeles goes through 5 periods in its history. We are living the 5th one, and those are not periods that are unique in the history of the country, but they're special and unique to this region, and they are contrary to what is thought as being this being a rudderless and historyless place. They're very special and critical, and they mark us in the place we live in very unique ways. The first period is the period 1781 to 1880, when Los Angeles is actually a village, a pueblo. This is a period that is organized initially by the Spanish crown and eventually by an American administration. It has the initial form of a northern Sonora desert village, as you can see here, in an early U.S. Army sketch of the early 1850s. It is surrounded by a pristine and beautiful countryside, mostly in agriculture for most of the 19th century, and it is grown deliberately through a process of repetition of building types, all of which are in the language of southwestern architecture emanating Mexico through Spain. So there couldn't be a more cogent beginning to the history of the region, and we're still bound by many of the decisions and many of the places that were defined during this period. The second period is perhaps more formative than the first. It's the period 1880 to 1900, a very brief period, but a very expansive one in terms of both population and spatial growth. What we have here is a Los Angeles which grows as a region based on the founding of towns on the routes of the Transcontinental Railroad. This is a Los Angeles that grows at its center to be a transshipment center, as you can see, very much in the same kind of method as the Mexican town had grown. This is actually a town which is basically Anglo-American. You can see the building types at the bottom. You can see the American grid organized infinitely upon the landscape of central Los Angeles. And it is a place that is begin to hum in terms of business and in terms of life, increasingly in the direction of its new Anglo-Saxon masters and away from its Mexican roots. Of suburbs like the ones that you see here in Brooklyn Heights across from downtown, and incredibly poetic and beautiful neighborhoods of the kind that still exist in a great number of places in Southern California. Through all of this, of course, is rumbling the machine of growth, and there's no image more beautiful than this overlay of cars, of transit trains, and of horse-drawn carriages in the streets of this great metropolis. The third Los Angeles is probably the most important Los Angeles of all in terms of its history and its form. It is really organized around the rapid transit system. A couple of thousand miles of it. It is powered by enormous investments in infrastructure, water harbors, airport, and so on. This is the system of the tram network that powered the growth of neighborhoods and central districts. Some of the towns built, this is Beverly Hills, in its first growth spurt, are some of the greatest cities that the West ever saw. And the downtown is a dense and powerful center of centers, with a kind of urbanity that would match that of Chicago and New York, now, of course, almost forgotten. What is most important about this Los Angeles is that about 20% of it is urbanized and 80% is in agriculture. And I have had friends who tell me that in the spring, the whiff of orange blossom in the suburbs of Pasadena was overwhelming, as much of the growth around the basin was in citrus. Of course, the fourth Los Angeles is the Los Angeles of sprawl. It is a Los Angeles that's based on questionable administration, the growth of the city of Los Angeles in a pattern that is based on irrational annexation, emphasis on locomotion by car, amazing national investments in road infrastructure, fairly useless long-term and overblown infrastructure, of course, causing smog and other unintended major social circumstances, among the worst of which was the very questionable way in which these freeways were actually built into the city, disturbing the balance of what was there and generating, as part of the nationwide process of urban renewal, clearance of a kind that both destroyed the essence of existing communities and generated architectures and urbanisms which were completely alien to the American spirit, whether they were one-off buildings introduced into downtown, which were insular and closed, or places like this in Orange County, which isolated uses and buildings from each other and turned every aspect of movement and any possibility for contact between people into an automobile trip. Of course, horizontal growth, sprawl, became the hallmark of this late civilization, and this was built on a number of extraordinary excesses the doubling of the size of houses in the last 30 years, ever larger cars owned by individual people, a level of consumption of foreign goods unprecedented in the history of the world. I mean, obviously, one of the reasons of the recent crash has been the fact that we're consuming, as this slide clearly indicates, much more than we're producing. An amazing energy binge, the likes of which the world has not seen, and then a culture of trash generation that is truly humbling. And in the midst of all of this, a culture, particularly a corporate culture of place alienation, the likes of which the world has not seen. I was in Little Rock last weekend, and I couldn't imagine where I was in the south, in the north, in the east, in the west. Walking through these environments, our country is completely trashed by a level of scalelessness and placelessness that we urgently need to reverse. So we are living the fifth Los Angeles. So what are the issues of the fifth Los Angeles? My first point is a plea that we stop greenwashing. Tell the truth. A glass building in Phoenix in the front of the New York Times Magazine is not a sustainable building. A Texas LEED building, which is a Walmart in the suburbs, is not a sustainable building. A Prius that we can drive around because it happens to be an economic vehicle is not a sustainable gesture. Flying organic food is not a sustainable gesture. 100% natural 7-Up is not an aspect of sustainability. 100% recyclable bottles of water is not an aspect of sustainability. Turning sustainability into fashion is greenwashing. We've spent the last 10 years merely trying to tell people that what we've been doing always, all the time, is not sprawl, but it's actually sustainable practice. And we absolutely need to get out of this denial immediately. We need to be thinking about regional infrastructure, and this is mostly in the area of policy. This is a SCAG map of a plan for Southern California that talks about maintaining and expanding transit by train, maintaining and keeping the freeway system as it is, and expanding the landscape environment of this basin to the maximum degree. So fixing the river, for instance, the Los Angeles River, is a major issue. Extending and maintaining the bus system of Los Angeles is an extraordinarily important subject. Building and continuing to maintain the tram transit and the light rail systems of Los Angeles is an extraordinary subject. Bringing jobs to the suburbs, building suburban concentrations of employment is a major subject. Improving the quality of education is a massive subject, and there is many, many more. The most important aspect of the world that we need to face is that the regulatory frameworks in place, mostly zoning, are archaic and destructive. We need to deregulate that system. We need to vision the future of the basin. We don't need indeterminacy of the kind that zoning provides. We need visions for a sustainable future, and we need to then find a way to organize form-based codes that support that kind of vision. We need to build sustainable buildings. This is one of our buildings for the NRDC in Santa Monica, the first LEED Platinum building. We need to build many, many buildings of this kind, but most importantly, we need to take much of what exists in our basin and maintain it. The most important aspect of sustainability is the reuse of existing buildings, and there is no doubt about the fact we can only afford to build buildings once, because the amount of energy it takes to build them means that we cannot afford to destroy them and rebuild them. We can only reclaim them. So I would say that adaptive reuse and restoration is critical to the world that is coming. And the most important subject of all is really no more sprawl. What does that mean? It means pursuing a kind of urbanization that is based on mature and complete streets that allow people, cars, bicycles, beautiful nature to coexist, transit that allows multiple ways of operating and circulating, so traffic is dissipated. It is about building buildings that generate public space. I think the idea of the public realm as an important aspect of our lives is critical to the future. This urbanization has to be compact in the sense that it has to operate within walkable sheds. It has to be really all about meeting most of our daily requirements within a walkable or bikeable shed. It has to do with diversity in that within the shed there need to be people, buildings, landscapes, utility and infrastructural systems that allow us to survive locally. And finally, we need to make absolutely sure that we forget about pork and we generate infrastructure of the kind that is simple, direct, and which services to as efficiently as possible. Narrow roads, no more expansive sewage plants, locally generated power, those kinds of things that have to do with understanding the differences between regions, the needs of each region, and generate infrastructure locally. Now, the examples of this, I'm showing you the case of Whittier, where in fact the number one issue in most of what's around us is actually infill. Infill is the religion we all have to practice from an architectural environmental point of view. We have to reclaim the public realm, as I said before. We have to make sure that everything that we do generates a walkable, bikeable, enjoyable outdoor realm, particularly in this beautiful climate that we have, that makes people want to live closer to each other. It has to do with bringing retail and office and housing closer to each other. It has to do with learning how to live more densely. It has to do with learning how to live on and around train stations in a transit-oriented pattern. And it also has to do with building in the edges on green fields, if we have to, in a pattern that is neighborhood-driven and which has long-term value. One of the most amazing aspects of the current environmental collapse in our country is that 90% of what has failed in the suburbs. And it has failed because both buildings on the retail side and buildings on the residential side are built with ridiculously narrow horizons of permanence. They're not durable, they're not useful, they don't pick up value, and all of that has to be reversed by reverting to a culture of complete permanence. What are we looking for? I would say at a minimum, and this is, believe me, a 15-minute discussion on a subject that can take hours, we're looking for conservation of land. This is in Paso Robles, two traditional neighborhoods, roughly half the land of what conventional sprawl occupies. This is the Atlanta region. Vehicle miles traveled in California, we have doubled the vehicle miles traveled in the last 30 years. We need to stop it, and we have to stop this increase in travel, and we need to reverse it. But look at what the importance of the urban pattern is. In the middle, we have less than 10 trips. On the edge, we have over 50 trips. And this is an image of gas of gases produced by urbanization that contribute to the greenhouse effect. And you can see that on the right-hand side that on a per capita basis, most of this gas production is in the suburbs. This is San Francisco. You can see that the center city produces per capita a lot less. And certainly we need cities that are compact and usable and reusable so that they can sustain the needs and the economies of future generations. In general, I would say that we have a great chance to meet the future needs of our region, but we have to come together and make some very hard decisions and some very hard investments, particularly because they run very much against the binge of the construction of the last 50 years. Thank you.
Kenneth Small is a research professor of economics at the University of California at Irvine. He previously served as chair of economics and associate dean of social sciences at UC Irvine, where he specializes in urban transportation and environmental economics. Recent research topics include urban highway congestion, measurement of value of time and reliability, effects of fuel efficiency standards, public transit pricing, and fuel taxes. He is Associate Editor of Transportation Research, Part B, Methodological, and is on the editorial boards of 4 other professional journals. He has served on several study committees of the National Research Council, examining, among other things, cost-benefits analysis and the federal programs on congestion management and air quality. Professor Small was honored in 1999 with the Distinguished Member Award by the American Economics Association's Transportation and Public Utilities Group, and in 2004 with the Distinguished Transportation's Research Award by the Transportation Research Forum. He is the recipient of the Faculty Achievement Award at UC Irvine for 2007 and is a Fellow of Regional Science Association International. He has advised the European Union, the World Bank, and other government organizations. Ladies and gentlemen, Kenneth Small.
Thank you very much, Ian, and all of you. Now, I'm the one that gets to do the computer manipulations here, so just give me 1 second. So I get to deliver the bad news, just in case you didn't already know it. Urban development leads to traffic. Traffic leads to traffic congestion. It's rather notable in Los Angeles. It does come in number 1, usually when it's measured quantitatively. And so I'm going to really tell you about it in 2 parts. The longer one is why does Los Angeles have so much traffic congestion? And the shorter one is what might we do about it? Perhaps it's shorter because that's the other bad news. A lot of what I'm saying, especially in this first part, comes from a very recently published book by the Rand Corporation, by several authors from the Rand Corporation. They're listed here. And so I want to acknowledge that, and that I'm not putting in a this is not an ad for it, but it is available if any of you want to see more. So why is congestion so severe? I'm going to give you a bunch of possibilities that people usually think about, and we'll find they're not all the case. Okay, lots of people think Angelenos drive more. Californians are in love with their cars, right? So that's fairly easy to check out. There's good statistics on this. And so among the 14 largest metro areas, which is what this Rand Corporation used as a comparison set, so a metro area is, you probably know it, the larger Los Angeles and comparable things elsewhere. In our case, depending on the exact statistics, it would typically include a 5-county area: Ventura, Orange, Riverside, and San Bernardino, as well as LA. In many of my statistics, it's the urbanized portion of those areas. So among the 14, well, we are above the median. We're 5th in automobiles owned per household. We're 5th in daily vehicle miles per person. We're only 9th in the percent of people who drive alone to work. So it doesn't seem as on the surface that is a special trait of Los Angeles that would explain why our congestion is worse than other places. So maybe there aren't enough roads. Now, probably a lot of you would not have thought of that. In fact, you might have said, well, maybe there's too many roads. But actually, a lot of people do cite this. Traffic engineers, anyone kind of dealing with traffic at a macro level would look at the number of cars out there, the number of roads to cover them, and compare. So it's worth looking at. Well, indeed, we are the first in the number of lane miles per square mile. So that's a physical density measure. But remember, we're a very large metropolitan area. And if you actually do it per person, we're about in the middle of that comparison 14 group. That's lane miles. So again, it doesn't appear that the road network is, at least just in pure size, such a distinguishing trait of Los Angeles as to explain our problems. Maybe there's not enough public transit. That's a very common complaint. So that also you can measure. There's pretty good statistics on metro area public transit. It happens in total bus service miles. That's the number of miles, vehicle miles per day run by bus companies. We're second now, maybe that's not really fair because we are also the second largest metropolitan area among these 14. But in bus service miles per person, we're third. I have to admit, I was quite surprised to see this. And even in rail, which is not our strong point, in rail track miles, we come out around in the middle of this comparison set. We don't come out way at the bottom. Again, this is partly because we're a very large metro area. So public transit doesn't seem to explain it by itself. How about population density? Now, we're going to talk a lot about sprawl tonight, or we have talked about sprawl, and I'm assuming you will want to talk more about sprawl. It's in the title of the forum. It's amazingly difficult to define sprawl when you actually try to do it in a numerical way. And I've seen a lot of papers and a lot of talks with a lot of different measures. The most common is just plain population density. People think, well, our density is too low. You know, you look at some of the pictures and it does appear that way. Well, those statistics are out there. They're pretty well. This is for the urbanized area now, so you don't have to worry about are we counting the deserts and mountains. And you can do them in a comparable way. The Census Bureau has specific definitions of what's an urbanized area. You can do them in a comparable way for all the metropolitan areas, actually many in the whole world, but in particular those 14. And I have a surprise for you. We're not only the lowest, we are the highest among those 14. This is not the city of Los Angeles or the county of Los Angeles, it's the urbanized area. That's in people per square mile. You might wonder, how can that be? And I'll show you a picture. It's not as exciting as some of the ones you just saw in terms of urbanization that maybe will give you a clue. But roughly speaking, compared to a metro area like New York, which has lower average density than Los Angeles, believe it or not, we're talking about the whole metropolitan area, Los Angeles has a somewhat lower density center and higher density outer parts. If any of you know the New York area, or actually Chicago, many other large cities, the suburbs there have lots and lots of areas with 1 house per acre, 1 house per 2 acres, 1 house per 5 areas. Los Angeles doesn't. We have pretty high density all the way out to the edge in most cases. So that's what I was warning you a minute ago, so that you didn't just think I'm talking about Los Angeles City. So if those aren't the problems, what is the problem? And here I really am going back to the RAND study, but I think they're right. They concluded that the amount of driving in Los Angeles, although it's not high per capita or per household compared to other cities, it is high for a city as dense as we are. Now you think about what makes congestion. You put together density and a lot of driving, and that's going to put a lot of cars in a small place. So let me show you a diagram which is directly from that RAND study, as I hope you can read the title there. This plots all of the metropolitan areas that I've been talking about, those 14, on a little diagram that shows you population density going along the bottom, and amount of driving measured as VMT, that stands for vehicle miles traveled per capita, a common measure, going along the vertical axis. And so you can see, you know, there's lots of scatter, but if you think about it, and I've cheated here in the next, I've just drawn a line in. This is not statistically fitted or anything, it's just my eyeball, which suggests that there's, for most places, there's a relationship that the more dense you are, the less people drive. And actually, this has been studied a lot, and I think it's well verified that it's true. You can do a better job than this. You can control for demographics and climate and lots of other things, and you still get the same answer. Los Angeles is an outlier on this diagram, quite notably. So one way to put it is that we're a very dense city that gives us lots of opportunities for urbanization or for urbanism that we aren't taking advantage of. Somehow we're still driving as though we were a much less dense city, you know, on a par with Detroit, San Francisco, Phoenix, Houston. So if, as I said a minute ago, if you put very high density together with even moderately high per capita vehicle use, as it's suggested that we did on that diagram, then you have a lot of congestion. Congestion is really just lots of cars in a single space. Why do Angelenos drive more than people in comparably high density areas? Well, this is maybe slightly more speculative, but Los Angeles is a very polycentric city. And here I think there is a tie with the previous presentation. You saw how we grew from these villages, and it was in relatively recent times that all of those villages got connected with what might be called sprawl. Those villages are still there mostly as subcenters. In fact, Los Angeles is full of subcenters. I've studied this quite a bit. There are other people in here and elsewhere who have studied them. Some of them are very specialized. UCLA Hospital was one of the centers. USC Hospital in East LA was one of the centers. I think UCLA also, in one of the studies that I did. Some of them are specialized in manufacturing. Hollywood is one. Of course, that used to be very specialized in movies. But others, particularly the ones that grew up from small villages, San Bernardino, Santa Ana, Ventura, these are now smallish, but you could say lively centers with a fairly diverse economic base, like downtown Los Angeles is. And so let me show you a picture of what this looks like. The next three slides are from a different source. This is Christian Redfern, who is a professor at the School of Planning, Policy, and Development at University of Southern California. And he kindly, he's published some of these diagrams, and he kindly sent me the whole set. This is a density map. This is a three-dimensional map, okay, on two-dimensional, so you have to exercise your right brain a bit here. Looking at the density of Los Angeles, which shows up as these peaks and hills. Today I drove over these low-density hills in the foreground toward one of the two on the left. Basically, you've got the big one in the middle is downtown Los Angeles. The two on the left, I'm pretty sure, these aren't labeled and it's a little hard to see, they are Westwood and Santa Monica. And there's more or less a high-density ridge extending from downtown all the way to Santa Monica. And this I and quite a few others have found in statistical studies. And then there are lots of other small hills here. And if you think about those, some of those are reasonable, you might call urban centers. Some of them are much more suburban, that you might not care for the characteristics so much. All of them tend to lead to this result that the density doesn't fall off real fast in Los Angeles. You tend to get this moderate density quite far out into the suburbs. And the same thing, I don't believe this diagram goes out to San Bernardino and Riverside, but you would see the same thing there, except more low density in between. In case you're interested in development, you might think about what would sprawl mean. Well, sprawl would maybe mean less, more uniformness, less of this density, more in the middle. So let me go backward in time for you. This is the year 2000. These are from census data. Here's 1990. And here's 1980. So let me run it back. Let me run it the other way. If you want to imagine Los Angeles growing according to this diagram, you just look at those three highest peaks, and you'll see over the decades they get bigger and more prominent. This is population density. I could do the same thing for employment density, which is maybe more informative, but the diagrams that I got for those are a little harder to see. There's various holes missing, so I didn't show those. So it appears that downtown is less dominant than other large cities. Another possible reason is that LA offers lots of cheap parking compared to a lot of other cities. Don Shoup has a nice book on parking which mentions that the Disney Center schedule when it opened was actually driven by the parking requirements that it was forced to get into with the private company that developed the parking underneath it, in part because of city codes that require this amount of parking. Lots of cities actually, such as San Francisco and Boston, restrict the amount of parking that a developer can put in. Los Angeles forces, they have minimum, you have to put in so much parking. What does that mean? Well, it means there's going to be lots of cheap parking available, and that, of course, is an encouragement to driving. A third reason, and I don't know quantitatively just how much this amounts to as far as the traffic, but we are a very big port city. I think it's fair to say as a proportion of our area bigger than any of the others, and that's partly because, as this says, 43% of all containers entering the U.S. come to the Los Angeles ports, and of course, some of those go to Los Angeles, but a lot of them go on through Los Angeles inland, and a lot of them go by truck. So that is adding a great deal to congestion on particular corridors, especially around Long Beach. So with this possibly discouraging set of facts, if you want to consider them facts, what can be done? So here's my speculations, if you will. Should we build more roads? Well, the problem with building more roads, aside from what you might think about the aesthetics and what it does to neighborhoods, which I agree is quite serious, is something that in the business we call induced demand, or sometimes it's called latent demand. Many drivers are now avoiding the worst congestion areas because of that. For example, I came up at 3:30 this afternoon, partly to avoid the rush hour, partly because I hadn't seen the Hammer Museum collection, and it gave me an opportunity to do that. But perhaps if congestion had been alleviated by some plan, I would have added myself to the rush hour congestion instead of almost beating it. I didn't quite. Induced demand is a very pervasive and very important phenomenon. It's been studied quite extensively. You can observe people shifting from all kinds of ways. They might shift from one mode, they might make new trips. Probably the most prominent is they shift the time of day of travel in response to even fairly small things that might otherwise improve the situation. So if you build more capacity, it tends to get filled up with these drivers as they shift to meet their own preferences. So what else might we do? Well, how about better transit service? Well, I happen to like transit service a lot, and I think that we could offer better transit service for many purposes, but it does actually raise the same problem of induced demand. That is to say, to the extent, and now I'm just talking about what effect it has on traffic congestion, to the extent that it begins to work by attracting people out of their cars, that does the same thing as more roads in that it creates more space so that people like me coming here at 3:30 in the afternoon might decide to come during a more congested period as well. So it is not really a solution to congestion. It may make some difference. But there's another problem with it, actually, which is that in the business, well, in the business we say it has a low cross-elasticity of demand. That's jargon for the fact that if you make improvements in public transit and you try to measure what effect that has on people's propensity to drive or take public transit, it's kind of a low effect. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Public transit only carries a pretty small percentage of trips now. And so even if you make a big increase in it, you don't make that much difference to road traffic. So you might actually do quite a lot with public transit itself, and I think we could, but it'll have a fairly minimal effect on road traffic, except maybe over a very, very long period of time. Is there a way we can overcome induced demand? Indeed there is, and you probably won't like it. You can make driving more expensive. That serves the purpose of deterring people from driving without having the auxiliary effect of encouraging other people to drive. So how might we do that? Well, we could raise parking prices. In fact, a lot of curbside parking in this area is quite cheap or even not priced at all, and that also tends to hold down the market price of private parking because they're competing with people trying to find their way around residential streets. We could curtail the number of parking spaces in various ways. That would force the private market to raise its price. We could also do it directly. A theme called congestion pricing, which is attracting quite a lot of attention nationally now. And you may have heard the city of New York came fairly close to actually adopting it. The mayor was behind it. The city council was behind it. The state legislature had to pass off on it, and they did not. But this would have charged people to come into Manhattan across a well-defined cordon during the main daytime hours. The rationale for that is that you're charging cars for what is really expensive to produce, which is fast peak hour travel. We can produce highways for cars to travel in the middle of the night. It's not that expensive. It would be less expensive if we didn't insist that they be able to go at 70 miles per hour, but even so, peak hour travel is what's really expensive because that's where you need the capacity. That's why those huge wide freeways that you saw in the previous presentation are so wide. It's not for the nighttime travel, it's for the peak hour travel. So wouldn't it make sense to charge people for that? Do you think this is a platform that is going to give me a political career, a good career in politics? I doubt it, but that's why I'm in this kind of a forum, and I welcome your thoughts about how this could work.
Well, thank you both. Let me begin with you, Stefanos. From your presentation, among many things I learned, is the quantum leaps in this. I mean, there's a great book called Cadillac Desert that essentially says that we live in a desert, an artificial desert civilization. And if it wasn't for the water that was brought to here by diverting the rivers, and as an adjunct to that, they built hydroelectricity. And incidentally, the big dams, Hoover and Glen Canyon, were built during the Depression. We framed this discussion in terms of whether or not we're on the cusp of a new depression or a serious recession. So I guess the lesson from the, and what I understand is really paradoxical is that the fastest growing cities, urban spaces in the United States are in the least sustainable states of Nevada and Arizona, and that water is really an issue. And we could reach a point now where with global warming and increased demand and less water in the Colorado River, that you could have these states, these urban centers like Nevada and Scottsdale that are growing like crazy now. They could suddenly become ghost towns. Is that a possibility?
I think it is. It is a possibility. I think that we have not turned our attention carefully enough to technologies that could recycle water, particularly recycle water from sewage. And there are a number of such systems in operation. There are a number of such systems in development. And we can learn a lot from them, and we can use a lot for them to huge advantage as we go forth in living in a place like Los Angeles or in a place like Phoenix. I don't have to tell you why people want to live here. There's a auditorium full. It was 82 degrees in Pasadena 3 days ago, and it was incredibly pleasant.
Well, that's the culprit. Every year, the Rose Bowl game, people freezing in the Midwest and in the East look at the background at the Rose Bowl and say, "Let's get in the RV and head west."
Can I comment on that also?
Go ahead.
Is my mic okay? First of all, a historical perspective. If you look back at ancient history, there were a lot of cities built in deserts. Egypt, the Indus Valley. There was just one excavated in ancient Peru from about 3,000 years ago. And they, of course, they all use irrigation. So this is not a new phenomenon. Now, some of those cities disappeared because of environmental problems. So I'm not saying that it's not a phenomenon we should be concerned about. But I agree with Stefanos that it's likely, or at least there are possibilities for dealing with it other than becoming ghost towns. And I think it's more likely we would find some of those. And a lot of the water that we use is actually for lawn irrigation and for agriculture, of course, outside of the urban areas. And that tends to be used not very efficiently. There was a study done a long time ago in Tucson where it happened. There were two sets of suburbs. One of them had their water priced and the other didn't. And guess which one had all the lush palm trees and tropical gardens in their lawns in a very desert area. So there are ways of dealing with water, I think, that we haven't really tapped yet.
Our consultants are telling us that, our engineering consultants, that the recycling of sewage in an environment where we get 10 inches a year would result in 80 inches being available for water use. So the results of recycling can be very, very dramatic, very dramatic.
And what about the possibility of capturing rainwater? Because all the rainwater just turns into mud and is washed away, particularly after we have
fires. We see what happens.
That is very much of an issue that can be addressed through new buildings and through new infrastructure. There are civilizations in the world that practice this and have practiced it. Most of them have abandoned it. But in the Greek islands, for instance, it's very typical to have the entire basement of houses be a cistern. It's very typical.
So when decisions are made, like the Mulholland decision, that the Chinatown movie was about, and what we were talking about earlier about how they were able to divert water to this area and create this city in the desert, and at the same time generate the electricity through these massive works programs in the Depression to electrify these cities. So I guess the impression I get is that a few people can make amazingly important decisions that have long-term consequences. So moving from the dystopian to the utopian, is it possible that people can get together and make the kind of decisions that bring about the results that you've shown us?
Well, I would suggest that most of the problems of sprawl, whichever way you cut at it, whether it's the collapse of the suburban environments we're witnessing out there, or the water problems as you outlined them, have an awful lot to do with the distortions in our civilization that brought about by cheap oil. It is really everything we build in place is being fueled by cheap oil, and in a sense, cheap oil has taught us to be deep believers in a Hail Mary theory of civilization, that one aspect of our lives can serve every other until the end of time. And we've been operating on this basis for a couple of generations now. We clearly have to switch over to a different kind of model that has to do with myriads of small decisions and small mid-course corrections that allow the world we live in to evolve in the direction I suggested. Clearly, you have to care about water, you have to care about energy, you have to care about schools, you have to care about materials, you have to care about, the list is endless. And good government plays an enormous role, as I try to point out, but it is really, there is no one decision that is going to undo us. It's the confluence of all the consequences of depending on oil that has brought us to this point, and the way out of it is practicing a much broader set of beliefs on the power of individual decisions and individual systems and individual aspects of the built environment being disconnected from oil.
So how do we get off the carbon economy? I mean, one of the slides that Stefanos showed was the early red car system that we had. I mean, I know the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit deals with what happened to this perfectly workable system that was either consciously or inevitably ripped apart. So how do we get back to that situation where you looked at that map and you think, my God, they had a better system back in the 40s.
I don't think it's really possible without some reforming of the urban structure. The urban structure that both of us have talked about is not very favorable for transit ridership. So just putting in the lines is not enough. I think transit-oriented development around the stations can help make it possible. I think lots of things can help make it possible. Densifying downtown Los Angeles, putting population in downtown Los Angeles, some of those which we are working on can help. But the rest of the world also is moving, although in a lot of parts of the world they have much higher transit ridership than we do, they are also moving toward more automobile ownership. So it doesn't seem as though the ingredients for the future are there in place anywhere else that we can look at as far as more transit ridership goes.
So does that mean we've just learned, if you watch the 60 Minutes piece recently, that the recent oil shock in the summer, where oil got up to $147 a barrel, it's now down to about 45, was largely generated by gaming on Wall Street through J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs. But let's assume that we have, I mean, in other words, in order to get to the world that Stefanos is saying that oil is really the culprit and cheap oil is actually cheap oil is the culprit, how do you get to expensive oil in order to get the Pavlovian effect?
I think that problem is going to be solved for us. I'm cautious about talking about oil as a finite resource because it's nowhere near as simple as a lot of people think. There isn't just so many gallons of oil there, and you can count them out. It comes in lots of different forms. You can extract it at higher cost, and unfortunately, greater environmental damage from lower quality sources, which are very, very abundant. But all of these things tend to raise costs, and the greenhouse gases from oil consumption, I think the world is starting to deal with. That's going to curtail it, and it's probably going to curtail it in a way that's going to make it more expensive. If we would just stop resisting, the American public, as some other countries' publics, have been quick to complain when gasoline prices go up because that's something they see every day and it comes out of their pocket and life seems hard and there's something you can complain about. But if we would accept that as not only a natural course but a desirable course of things, that would put an economic incentive into as an additional booster toward the direction that you're talking about.
Well, the question you ask is very complex because it has to do not only with what we have to do, but also what we have to stop doing. For example, we have to definitively stop building roads. We have to definitively stop building roads. Happily, in Southern California, we crossed that threshold, and I think our governor, the one before this, when he opened up the last section of the 210, said in the inauguration of the 210 extension, this is the last freeway we'll ever see in Southern California. The fact is, these roads are very expensive, and they generate a pattern of development that exacerbates the worst of the sprawl consequences we briefly discussed today. So that it is very disturbing, it is exceptionally disturbing to see the Obama administration spending $30 billion, gifting it to departments of transportation in various states around the union who are dedicated essentially to building roads. I think that is a catastrophe under the present circumstances. What I think needs to be, on the other side, the most optimistic way of understanding where we're going, for the ones of you who've lived in Southern California for 30 years, is that we're already halfway there to the pattern that you were admiring before 1945. I remember when I first came in 1973, one of my colleagues in the university had his father was an architect commute from Eagle Rock to Laguna Beach. I mean, if you were to do this today, you have to be certifiably mad. People have begun to organize their lives more locally. I think getting on the freeway in the morning is a serious adventure for a lot of people. People don't go very far to meet their commercial needs. There is an awful lot of local retail. I mean, I think all 88 Los Angeles towns and cities now have their downtowns pretty much restored. So there is a certain kind of consolidation of local culture in Southern California. They're still car oriented and car dependent, but which I think is on its way to a better pattern. The tragedy is that we destroyed 2,500 miles or 2,000 or so miles of tram, of streetcar, and we're going to have to rebuild every last bit of it. And we're building every last bit of it as we're going, but it's remarkably expensive. It's the worst single decision made in the history of the state, worth probably $1 trillion by the time we're done. And we're going to have to build a system in order to sustain the growth of our state. And it is going to be one where, unfortunately, it's going to take probably 200 years to do it, maybe 100 years to do it. And it is not going to be until some critical moment, some turning point in which there's enough of it that we might be able to truly affect the behavior of people. when people leave their house without a car and feel they can return there safely someday, then we'll have an alternative to the car in Southern California. Until then, the size of the basin is so immense that it's very difficult to move around without a vehicle. So we are in a terrible bind, and a bind that, if we don't address very fast, is going to affect our economic performance and our way of life probably in the long term.
Well, just a last question to both of you before we go to Q&A then. Do you accept the premise that this is both a crisis and opportunity, that because of this enormous federal infrastructure spending that's going to take place, what kind of a sense do you have? As Stefanos said, he's distressed by $30 billion going into freeways, and you hear this debate on the Hill now. They're proudly saying this project is shovel ready. I mean, are we just talking about bricks and mortar and pouring concrete? Are we talking about a vision here? Because the whole purpose of this talk tonight is to get a sense that there's a vision as opposed to the dystopian reality of gridlock.
It's hard to use a crisis as a chance for a vision, but perhaps it's possible, and I think it makes a lot of difference whether citizens think that way and put pressure on them. I do want to comment about roads a bit. I don't agree that we don't need any more roads, because I think there are a lot of places where there are bottlenecks that we could alleviate. But also I would remind everyone two things. First of all, a lot of the money that departments of transportation want for roads now is for maintenance, so they're trying to take the roads we have and put them back in good shape. And the other is that buses use roads. And we can't rebuild a rail system, or maybe we wouldn't want to rebuild the rail system to the extent that it once was overnight, but you can put buses on very quickly. And actually Los Angeles has about twice as much bus service now as rail service. And some of that service can be pretty good. Los Angeles has been one of several leaders in the country of trying out rapid bus systems. And so I'm not so discouraged about the fact that what is 30 billion, 3% of this stimulus package might end up in some roads if we can find the right projects for those. I encourage everybody to lobby for what you think is a good way to spend that money. Given the time frame that it's trying to be done, I'm not that optimistic that you can use this as a time to really articulate a new vision of how things should be done.
I'm actually in favor of trying to lead the federal government through a vision of physical development, not only through the pressure of spending. I am an Obamite to the core. I'm a Democrat of my entire life, and I'm terrified of the federal government because I believe in history and I know it well. And I was present in the events of the last 20 years when the Congress for the New Urbanism was instrumental during the Clinton administration in reversing 30 years of nonsensical federal public housing project policy, during which we destroyed three-quarters of $1 trillion worth of buildings which were abandoned and useless, and began to turn these freestanding European-inspired filing cabinets for people into neighborhoods. And the public housing system in this country, as imagined during the Roosevelt era and under the Great Society, is a great example of the federal government gone wild, wildly wrong. And we have to be extremely careful about our belief in government. In the same way, we have to be terribly skeptical of the belief in what has recently failed us. So I believe that spending by itself is something we all need to be terribly concerned with. And we need to ask why every turn of the way, to what end, to what consequences. That's why I try to finish my lecture with a relatively incomplete number of consequences that I think we need to be aiming for as urbanists and as architects and as citizens. We need to make sure that when we spend $860 billion, the environmental consequences of this $860 billion deliver positive results in at least half a dozen different fields. I don't hear anybody at the federal government talking about consequences. All they're talking about is cash. And that is absolutely wrong in my estimation.
So let's open the discussion up to the audience, and I know there are people who've come far and wide. There's the bicycle lobby is here, I believe, which is a wonderful. I hope we find some members of the bicycle lobby. Since you're standing up here, wait for the microphone though; it's going to come down. No, wait. The audience wants to hear you.
Thank you. Is it on?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to hear the vision that each of you have for the next 100 years.
That's a long time. I deal in statistical projections. I wouldn't trust any of them for 100 years.
I give you a vision for 20 because I think that when you look at the history of Los Angeles over 100 years, the social and the technical developments are so extreme after a certain point, or the shift or the change, the delta is so extreme that I think it would be tyrannical and absolutely uncalled for us to even be thinking about talking about 100 years from now.
One way to put it is just that if you try to think of a specific policy, say involving adaptation to climate change or public transit or so forth, and then try to think what's the world going to be like 100 years from now. Well, look at today. What was the world like 100 years ago? Could they have imagined the various technologies that we take for granted? So I think that's one reason why it's very hard to make that vision.
Microphone on this side. Down here in front here.
And if you're asking about why we're not excited about being futurists, I would say I'm personally very excited about being a counter-futurist, trying to understand how we can survive in terms of 18th and 19th century ideas, not 22nd and 23rd.
Question here in the front.
I'm curious to what extent you've studied transportation solutions at urban centers overseas, such as Rome, Paris, London, and if any of those options are viable for our urban centers, such as bike sharing and car sharing.
Yes, there are lots of good ideas from overseas. The bike sharing is one. Paris has made a real go of that. I mentioned congestion pricing. There are 2 cities overseas that are doing that now with these cordon prices, Stockholm and London. Actually 3. Singapore has been doing it for a long, long time. Lots of people look at the better public transit systems, especially the subway systems in foreign cities, and they say, great, that's the way to go. But I do have to warn you, there's quite a difference in the urban structure in those places from here. And also, just a warning, if you travel like I do a lot, it's easy to think, oh man, these cities are so great. You know, I got my downtown hotel and I can just go anywhere. But actually, most people who live in those areas don't travel in those places. They travel elsewhere, and that's why they still use cars fairly predominantly, even if not as much as we do.
I would agree with Ken and say particularly the Europeans are particularly terrible about this because they think of their downtowns as being Disneylands and not being active and real and generative urban centers, which is a terribly destructive aspect of the European state of mind. We do study the transportation systems of various countries. We admire many of them. I mean, I think I would like to mention, for instance, the bicycle systems in Amsterdam and in Stockholm are just completely stunning by any measure, or the boat systems in the Thames and the Seine are remarkable. And the reason why they exist is because the federal government and the state governments and the municipal governments in these countries have the gumption to actually impose anti-car systems on people and take the political heat for it, and they're also willing to subsidize them to a remarkable degree. There is no reason, for instance, there is no boat service from Santa Barbara to Malibu, to Ventura to Malibu, to Santa Monica, except that it needs to be subsidized. And nobody's willing to subsidize, but particularly in the state that's already falling apart because we're overextended under the existing car-dominated infrastructure.
But what about a bullet train to LA, San Diego, San Francisco, San Jose? I mean, if you fly today without taking your shoes off and having your shampoo confiscated and all that nonsense you go through, it's almost the same time as a bullet train would take.
Well, I think one of the most important questions that we all need to begin to think about is how our transportation investments and our land use decisions and our housing decisions begin to overlap. I think that is a very important question. I think the bullet train question is not a transportation question. It's an urbanization question. It's a way of actually consolidating the valley into real cities, the Great Valley into real cities, and making those cities accessible to the great California centers of San Francisco, Sacramento, and Los Angeles, and San Diego to some extent, and vice versa. I think we are going to live to see through various bills already passed by our legislature in California, we're going to live severe limitations on single track development.
Question on this side. This lady in the middle here with a hand up.
Thank you. I would like to ask either one of you, we've talked about examples overseas of other systems that might work. Do you have a kind of favorite area in Los Angeles where you think that things are working best that we could look at kind of on our front doorstep?
Well, I'm a fan of these rapid bus lines in Los Angeles, except the orange line seems to have some safety problems, which I haven't quite figured out whether they're inherent or just a glitch. That's what comes to mind first.
I mean, you don't know whether people are just stupid for getting stuck on the tracks, or...
Yeah.
I think there are countless examples in Los Angeles, too many to list. I mean, every town and city in Los Angeles has magnificent traditional neighborhoods, every single one. When you fly from the air, look at where darkness is underneath you, where there is vegetation, and go there and look them over, everywhere. There are beautiful town centers everywhere, traditional town centers, everywhere. Now we have 88 in Los Angeles County and many others beyond. I think what's been built of the new train system is absolutely remarkable. There are many wonderful things going on, many that we can be very proud of.
But not enough.
Not enough, yes, of course, because of the size of the problem.
This side, any questions over up in the back there? There's a lady with a hand up.
Hi. What do you think about Measure R in Los Angeles? Do you think it's going to be successful? Is it going to integrate well if it ever gets completed? Thanks.
Could you quickly explain Measure R?
Just the rail system. It's going to be going to the west side and to the ocean and to connect LAX to downtown, and just
right.
It just passed in Los Angeles on the ballot.
I'm sure it will be very nice. It's an extraordinarily expensive way to accomplish its goals. It's probably not the way I would have chosen. I would have looked at the bus systems to try to do a better job of that. What mostly amazed me about Measure R is that Angelenos were really willing to pass more sales tax on top of, I think it's already 1% dedicated sales tax dedicated to transportation projects. I don't know how long people will be willing to pay for transportation that way. I wish we could come up with a better financing system. Maybe our economic crisis is solving that for us. But I hate to see so much of transportation financed through a sales tax, which I consider rather regressive.
This side down in front, this gentleman down here.
I wondered about 6-7 months ago, Stefanos, a lot of the notions that you were putting forward about building up around rail centers and stuff like that were very much on people's minds because gas was at, $4 a gallon. And you mentioned congestion pricing on freeways, but wouldn't a gasoline tax achieve some of these same things in terms of what you were asking about, raising the price of oil to the point that might limit some of the demand for freeways and also get people to want to live near a public transportation system?
Yes. The answer is yes. We are spending $700 billion in 2000. We spent in 2008 $700 billion in oil expenditures to producing countries. Many of them are enemies. I think this was mentioned widely during the campaign, and nobody flinched. The Congress is aflame over the issue of the stimulus, but they happily stay mum over the subject of spending an equal amount of time literally burning it like little joints every year, and that's a remarkable amount of money. That's an absolutely remarkable amount of money that is actually essentially bankrupting the country. So in one form or another, we are going to force ourselves, I think, to find a way around this subject. This is the key question of the next 8 years, as far as I can see, and as you noticed, it's not being directly addressed.
The reason I didn't mention gasoline tax when I talked about making driving more expensive is because I was talking specifically about congestion, and although the gasoline tax would have some effect on congestion because it's general, it's for all driving, it doesn't offer that targeted incentive that you really need to get people to avoid those most congested areas. I do think it would have an effect on the overall amount of driving, the overall development that accompanies it, and it would have an effect on fuel efficiency, and it would certainly help support the fuel efficiency standards that are now in legislation and the stronger ones that I think are fairly likely in the near future.
This side here, down in front, there's a lady in the far corner.
I think this is very fascinating, but I think one of the things that is an issue for us is that people get in their cars and drive because they can't afford to live near their jobs. So we have people who are low-earning people who have to come in from far distances in order to get to work. And the issue of infill and trying to develop live-work situations or create centers where people can be employed, I think is one alternative. However, we don't see in some of the infill, like in the downtown areas, any plans for low-income people or for mixed-use housing. Is there anything going on around that you're aware of?
No, and I mean, if you begin to pile the crisis on and delineate them one after the other, we're not going to have a happy night tonight. I mean, we're not going to sleep well. But let me say that one of the significant aspects of the crash has been the enormous cost of capital for building housing, and the only way to build condos in Los Angeles is for developers to go into enormous risk and get money from people to build it, with every single negative outcome or positive outcome being passed on to the buyers, with the result being the prices accelerating remarkably. I think the government is going to have to be in the business of lending to people to build housing. There's just no doubt about it. I received an email today from the people I talk to every day with a couple of petitions to the national government to put in place a $10 billion fund to rotating fund. This is not a handout. This is actually a bank to lend money to build rental housing in center cities. I mean, we have avoided the problem that you mentioned. The problem of affordability is abandoned, and cities are dealing with it with irrelevant patches like asking developers to pay $40,000 per unit in Pasadena, which are passed on to the 36 people that live in the condominium afterwards. I mean, what kind of silliness is this? How can you ever deal with a question of imbalance in housing prices and affordability? Item 36 in our list.
Santa Barbara apparently has that problem because real estate prices are so high because of the particularly in Montecito and places like that, where the very wealthy live, that all the first responders, police, fire, nurses, all of those people can't afford to live anywhere near the city they're living in, as far away in Goleta and all the way up to Buellton, etc. And they have these long commutes. So there's a theory that if anything happens in Santa Barbara that's serious, then there'll be nobody there to to handle the crisis. This gentleman down in front here.
You mentioned very early on in your presentation the concept of preserving existing buildings as a very sustainable concept. The city of LA recently passed an ordinance for LEED and sustainability dealing with new construction, but they haven't recognized the concept of preserving existing buildings, which seems to be contradictory in light of the recent news about the Century Plaza Hotel being considered for demolition and replaced with two 50-story towers.
Well, you know, it is very difficult to comment on individual projects, but I want to tell you that I don't believe in the LEED system. And the reason I don't believe in the LEED system is because I think it's a sham. It's being promulgated by a private organization who I think is to be admired for having gotten this far. But I want you to know that in California, every single major building being built, I'm talking about an institutional level building or a commercial building, is already, by the codes we have in place, almost exactly a silver building, a LEED silver. So when somebody tells you they're going to do a LEED silver building, you have to laugh at them and say, so what else are you going to do? Because we're already there by the basic codes of our city, or cities, or state. The other thing that upsets me about the LEED system is that it is dominated by bells and whistles considerations. It's an engineer system about dealing with the future of building in our country, which places spending money on mechanical systems on a much higher level than recycling buildings or building livable buildings that will withstand the test of time. Let me give you a small example. I was at Caltech yesterday for the inauguration of one of the buildings of my good friend Tom Main. And this is not a Tom Main attack, it's just a statement of complete fact. 70% of all the rooms in that building have no light or air, and the windows are not operable. And this building is a LEED gold building. As far as I'm concerned, it's a travesty. Think about it. In Pasadena, a building where in the winter it's 17, 80 degrees, where you cannot open a window, and it's a LEED gold building. I mean, come on. Who is fooling whom? I think we need to develop a whole other way of thinking about what's a truly important scale for measuring these buildings. And you know, individual issues about what you take down, what you don't, is a whole other subject. But durability is a key idea, I think.
On this, could you bring the microphone down to this gentleman here with his hand up on the right?
I was kind of interested in the fact that you didn't mention, with regard to the foreign cities you've looked at, anything about Havana and Cuba's experience with urban agriculture, possibly the elimination of all these 18-wheelers competing with the Priuses in the urban streets of LA, delivering food to Ralph's, etc. I just wonder what you might have to think about Cuba.
I'm not sure I have particular attitude towards Cuba. I've not been there. I'd love to go. I think urban agriculture is a remarkable idea. It's an important idea that needs to be seriously considered in the future.
Cuba is a kind of model for what happens when you suddenly don't have gasoline from one day to the next. When the Russians pulled the plug, right, until Chavez stepped in to rescue them, they had a real serious problem, and they adapted in all kinds of creative ways. So I recall when they had the 1970 oil shock here, and when you had to have odd days, you could buy gasoline if your license plate ended with an odd number and an even number the next day. And people were literally weeping that they couldn't buy gasoline on the particular day because of this simple restriction. So I think we are truly pathetic when it comes to addictions. That's my point, I guess.
You have to be very careful about unintended circumstances.
This has been studied. Mexico City has a system like that. It's not whether you can buy gas, it's whether you can drive in the city. And indeed, people have responded by buying second cars, which are usually higher polluting. So.
Deal with that. If we need to move forward quickly, how do we deal with this attitude of a few people can stop a whole city.
Yeah, let me address that. Oh, I guess you were finished. First of all, the cities that have been really successful with rapid bus systems have found ways to give them dedicated lanes. Now, that's not, I mean, that's a challenge because it's not like we have lots of extra street capacity. But that is one way to do it, and that also is another way of kind of curtailing cars. Rail systems are more fuel efficient if people are riding them. So that's the big question you need to look at if you're thinking about comparing a proposed rail system with a proposed bus line is which one will attract the ridership. One thing the bus lines have going for them is that a lot of times you can offer an integrated trip where you can do most of all of your trip on a single vehicle, which is often harder to do with rail stuff just because there aren't as many stops.
And in answer to your question about neighbors and the political process, I would say that we're experiencing a slow but steady shift from political activists organizing to stop things to political activism becoming a way of thinking about, bringing forth a new future. And I would hope that more and more visioning and coding projects begin to bring people together to be thinking about the consequences of their actions in that respect. I do think that we need to engage in massive education and in massive political action in having people understand clearly the fact that the most effective way we have to control global warming and probably every other malady from here to there is really the configuration and functioning of the urban fabric that we live in. It is a much more effective way of doing it than trying to change the engines of cars or stopping people from going about their businesses or doing anything else, I think, that is at our disposal. So we need to encourage people to act that way, and only through this kind of common action will we see change.
I would think that the antidote to the opposite of political action is political corruption, it seems. And I understand that the rail line that goes all the way to the airport ends at Imperial Highway on the wrong side of the airport. Within a mile of the airport, it seems like the stupidest thing imaginable. And the only explanation I've ever gotten out of anybody about that is that the taxi lobby lobbied the council. So does anybody have any information on that?
That's correct.
Okay. This gentleman here.
Plus it was supposed...
Also, the FAA had a voice, along with the airline operators, the carriers, together with the FAA, about interference with the electronics with this light rail transit electrified catenary running crisscross in front of the approach to the big runways and the landing strips. And that has been an explanation that you might hear from the MTA. The MTA will use that as a reason why they didn't go right into the terminals. And of course it would have required a subway construction, and they did cost out subway construction, probable construction cost estimates, to tunnel into the central terminal area there alongside the old original air traffic control tower, where there's currently a parking structure. They would have had a terminating station there, but that was all scrapped when the FAA and the carriers started fussing about this electrical catenary light rail transit going back and forth across the threshold of the approach apron for these for the runways.
But is that a bogus excuse?
No, like I think it was true. You'd have to check the LA Times and check the history on it. But
what about all the other airports in the world?
That figured in it. Yeah. What about Chicago? O'Hare has that wonderful train comes right into the terminal buildings.
All right. Any questions on this side? There's a gentleman there with his hand up.
I have a question. A lot of the stuff we talk about is the urban area. I know I grew up in Long Beach, but I've also spent a lot of time living in the Inland Empire area, and I can say that over the past 15 years, I've seen a significant growth everywhere from Reno Valley all the way to Ontario. What used to be open orchards and fields has now become malls, homes, and a bunch of other uses. I will say that driving around the area, I see that there's still a lot of open areas in between. You'll have shopping centers and homes. And I know that there used to be plans, you know, to either put up homes or other areas. And there's also talk about mixed-use space and also centralizing workplaces in those areas. With the recent slowdown, things have kind of like taken a pause with that. But I would ask, would you gentlemen think that right now with this pause, it might give an opportunity for more people to think about using some of those open spaces out there and using it as an opportunity to start making plans to set an example for areas out here in this, you know, closer towards LA and urban areas, kind of set up a model for them to use in the future?
Are you speaking of the type of design?
Oh, in the use of the space, because you said you have a lot of open fields out there. You know, some of them are being turned into warehouses, which I think is kind of a waste. But just the use of probably homes and actually getting office and workspace jobs closer so that people know how to commute. Because I know my mother for years commuted from Moreno Valley out here to LA and back and forth 5 days a week for a good part of almost 10 years. So, I mean, do you think that might actually give them an opportunity to start saying we need to try to reuse this space in a beneficial way? Because they're going to build things there eventually, whether it's going to be a mall, a tract of homes, or, you know, something else that might, you know, not be of best use. Do you gentlemen think that might, you know, in that area, because growth was big out there for the longest time, but now it's kind of taking a pause. So you think in this reset it might give developers a chance to rethink what they plan on doing with it, or?
I think it was Rem Emanuel who said that the recession is a terrible thing to waste. I think that the problem that we're facing, or the challenge we're facing in places like the Moreno Valley, is that we cannot continue to build sprawl in the way we built it before, and probably we're going to see very little of it in the future, considering the collapse of the economic values of all that was built there over the last 10, 20 years. We need to think about building real cities out there. I mean, and I mean that literally, a mixture of uses, a combination of densities, a synergy of uses of the kind that does not exist in this kind of suburbia that rules out there. And we're headed there via, with the good graces of our legislature in Sacramento, who is passing rules that increasingly are arguing against sprawl on environmental performance grounds. So we need to change planning policy and planning process, and we're getting there.
This side here, this gentleman over here.
Yeah, it seems to me we have a kind of a crisis of lack of imagination from our government. And looking at the figures you mentioned, just doing a little mental arithmetic, it seems to me California has, I think, 33 million people. The United States has about 300 or maybe 330 million people. So California is about 10% of the country. So on a per capita basis, then $850 billion would come down to $85 billion for the state of California. And Stefanos' figures about oil, we buy about $700 billion of oil per year recurrently, like having a credit card bill that much. So it strikes me that the economical thing to do is to take that $85 billion and apply it to the local generation in California of clean, sustainable energy that produces zero carbon footprint, so we can directly attack global warming and stop that. And meanwhile, and then I would suggest too, as a positive suggestion, that you guys down at UC Irvine create a interdisciplinary program to figure out how to use sustainable energy. Essentially, think of how you would solve the problem of what would you do with free electricity forever, and apply that to the problem of the system design of architecture. I suggest that Stefanos would like to basically use it to build transportation systems for these localized neighborhoods. So I'd like to get your responses to this.
That's a lot of ideas. UC Irvine does actually have a good center in engineering working on various forms of using electricity for vehicles. I don't know if that's quite what you're talking about. Yeah, I don't know about architecture. We don't have a school of architecture, so I'm not sure how that plays there. Let me pass that to you.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I know how to produce free energy. First of all, I don't know how that happens, but I think there is interesting work going on, trying to understand whether there's a possibility of generating electricity or electrical energy on a neighborhood and district basis and not on a building by building basis. It's not very clear yet how these things are most efficient. But when in one of the principles that I presented, the one of efficiency, I literally meant beginning to imagine what is the best way of addressing our infrastructural needs away from the traditional models, which I think are not serving us right at this point, whether it's freeways or gigantic engineering systems conveying stormwater or sewage across a whole territory and so on. We need to, or electrical generation in Utah transported to Southern California at a loss of 70% of its capacity and so on. I think focus on small but transformative infrastructure projects are very much a piece of the coming future.
And right in back there's a lady in back with her hand up. I'd love to get a question from the bicycle lobby, if that's possible.
Well, I'm not the bicycle lobby, but I do ride my bike, and that was going to be one of my questions. So, firstly, I think that there are actually a lot of people and organizations in LA who are trying to work on more sustainable ways of living, which is really wonderful. I just think that we need to educate ourselves more about those. And as far as bicycles, I'm just wondering, why do we not have more bicycle lanes? And has there been a study done on safer ways of travel? Because I'm on my bike, I ride my bicycle, but there's times where you're in areas where it's difficult to ride your bike. So has there been any studies done on that?
There are expansive studies on bicycle. Would you like to talk about it, Ken?
Yeah, a lot of people have studied bicycles both from safety, from operational, and Stefanos mentioned earlier some cities in Europe. Germany is another country that has some interesting bicycle provisions that have been studied here involving giving bicycles a chance to get in front of the traffic that's stopped at a red light so they get to go out before the cars. I think it takes a lot of work, and that is an area where the Europeans are ahead of us, and we could learn a lot from them. Just putting in a bicycle lane is nice. There's lots of bicycle lanes in Irvine. I love it, but I don't think it's itself creating a big new bicycle culture. It's good for Saturday clubs, but I don't see many other bike commuters. I happen to be one. So I think it takes a lot of effort. Chicago, I don't know if the bicycling there is that big numerically, but they have done a few things, including taking advantage of a nice natural area along the lakefront and putting in a facility downtown where people, with extensive bike parking, secure, and with showers. So there are a dedicated few commuters, even in a climate like that, who go in regularly from fairly far on bicycles. So I think
even in the winter?
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of them was the reporter who wrote this up, so it might be a community of one.
Okay. I would very much encourage you to Google Dutch bicycle manual or Amsterdam bicycle manual and see if you can get to that document and buy it and look through it. It is truly stunning. I mean, it'll completely surprise you and delight you. One of the things I want to point out is that it is very important to relate the existence or the presence of bicycle lanes to the speed of cars circulating the streets. When cars are going from under 25 miles an hour, there is no need for a bicycle lane. Indeed, the safest way to ride a bicycle is in narrow streets in which cars are going slow enough for the cyclist to feel right. So one of our greatest and most pro-bicycle design actions that we typically take is to keep street dimensions between 28 and 32 feet in width, including parking, which is on both sides, which is actually a remarkably radical thing to do, and has gotten us into deep trouble with almost everybody, particularly fire departments all over the western United States. But it's the right thing to do. When the speed of cars goes above 25 miles an hour, then you have to protect the bicycles by providing lanes for them. If you put lanes in streets where cars are supposed to go at 25 miles an hour, so we go from 28, say, to 35, or from 36 to 41, all of a sudden you get cars to speed in residential streets, which puts bicycles' lives and pedestrian lives in danger.
Down in front, there's a gentleman here in the red shirt.
I was going to propose a very cheap solution, which was to
bring the mic.
The cheap solution would be to close narrow roads, side roads, off entirely, which would have two positive effects. One would be less roads for cars, which was what you actually mentioned. Less roads would make it more difficult to ride and discourage people to take their car. And the other one would be to provide safety for cyclists, because the road would be all theirs.
Lots of cities have experimented with all kinds of ways of keeping local streets from becoming through traffic corridors. And I think they're successful. It's always difficult to balance the local interests of the people who live there, who basically want no traffic, and the interests of the residents at large who want to be able to move around. So you have to find some way of balance. But you can close them off. You can have lanes that end, so you can only make a turn in one direction and things like that. It does lead to a city sometimes where it's hard to get around. I still remember moving to Brookline, Massachusetts, where I lived for 1 year, and it took us 1 hour to find a way legally to get about 1 block to this new house we were going in because of all the one-way streets and all the closures and everything. Eventually, we found out in Boston you don't have to do it legally, so we just were naive.
God is also in the details. I would urge you to really look at minute details when it comes to the balance between cars and bicycles and streets. The thing that I remember most fondly about Stockholm is that the sidewalks are continuous and the bike lanes are continuous. In order to take a road, a right from a road into a road, you have to go up a little ramp, through the sidewalk, down a little ramp, and on. So it is the cars that are inconvenienced in turning right and left, and the pedestrian and the bicycles are moving seamlessly through the city. So look at minute details that would delight you and really surprise you.
Interesting. Yes, this has been the last question here. This gentleman next to you.
Yeah, taking advantage of the bicycle opportunity to ask another question about bicycles. Actually, I'm very involved in bicycle advocacy, and we're faced with a lot of the same challenges that you mentioned for some of the other actions, such as creating more livable, dense areas, raising the price of fuel. It's finding the political will to implement bicycle infrastructure. There's really no shortage of techniques from other countries and even from this country where there's been progressive bicycle techniques used to improve the accommodation for cyclists. But getting it built in the context of Los Angeles, where you have so many people who are driving who feel very strongly about keeping all the road capacity they have, it's a constant battle for us to try and find space on the road. But I will say, to whatever extent we can create more walkable, dense, livable communities, that's going to be good for cyclists. And so here's a question. We often hear that, yeah, walkable, denser communities, great, but you got to have the transit before you can do that. That's why it won't work in Los Angeles, because it's going to take so long to build the transit. I'm wondering, have you all seen examples where you can benefit from these denser, walkable city patterns without having the super expensive transit in place already?
I saw a study of some communities in the South Bay. I've forgotten exactly where it was. Manhattan Beach. It was near Manhattan Beach. Sorry, maybe where there was a surprising amount of walkability in what's basically an auto-dominated city without any transit. I don't know the ingredients in terms of zoning or planning how you get developers to do that, but it does seem to be possible to have village centers that attract walking. I do know that you can mandate it and not have it work very well, because I happen to have a relative who used to live in Reston, Virginia, and I also read about Columbia, Maryland, which are the planned cities that were really planned around this. And it turned out, most people actually preferred to drive out of the town to a larger set of stores. So this nice village center was kind of a ghost town. But I don't know exactly the ingredients for what makes one work, what makes it work in one place and not in another.
One of the, well, I'll give you a couple of examples. One of them is Pasadena, where preceding the gold line, the arrival of the gold line, the city had designated a parking limit of 1 car per unit in the downtown, and had allowed the existing bus lines through the city to actually be distributed in such a fashion through the area that they could service and the increasing densification of the downtown. And with the advent of the gold line in the last 10 years, there have been about 6,000 units built in downtown Pasadena, which is quite remarkable. There are many. The other challenge and a tremendous opportunity is expanding the notion of transit-oriented development to mean bus as well as rail-oriented development. And I think that along every corridor in Los Angeles County, there is an opportunity to build along the arterial roads that we have. We could virtually double the density of Los Angeles and not notice it, because it wouldn't touch any of the single-family areas in the region, and we would have a much better city, better retail, and certainly greater access. So I would encourage you to think about working through the general plan and specific plan process in the cities where you live to get this kinds of densities, and in particularly positive forms organized around transit corridors.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our two guests tonight. I think it's been a very, very interesting